Hello everyone and welcome to this video podcast on Annex 6 to the NAMA support project outline. As you might already know, Annex 6 is about the mitigation potential of NAMA support projects. My name is Jasmin Sevenik. I work at the technical support unit of the NAMA facility and I'm looking forward to zoom into one filled-in example of the Annex to provide to you some further guidance on it. Before we start, I want to highlight two important points. The first one is that you will hopefully learn a lot while watching this video, but that it will nonetheless be necessary that you also consult additional documents when filling in this annex. For example, the NAMA facility M&E framework that provides more information on our mandatory core indicators, for example N1, the GHG mitigation potential, but then also other sources, for example on methodology selection. The second thing is that the objective of this video is not to present to you the details of a good NAMA support project, but rather to utilize a fictional NAMA support project to guide you through the newly developed Annex 6 template. This slide, which you might have already seen in our last webinar on the introduction to the 7th call, summarizes quite nicely why we revised the Annex and also what we are expecting to see in the Annex 6 for the 7th call. A typical challenge that we faced in the past is that even though numbers on the mitigation potentials were presented with the outlines, in a lot of cases explanations or calculations were missing, which made it very difficult to understand the presented numbers. All in all, with the updated Annex now, we seek applicants for more information, for example, on the source of data and most importantly for equations instead of only results. With this, I will now open the example Annex 6 that I just mentioned. But before we dive into the details, let me briefly provide you with an explanation on its general structure. This Excel file has 6 individual spreadsheets. The first one that you can see right now just contains an introduction. And here you will find, for example, explanations on the color coding. For example, you will see that blue cells are cells for inputs. If you click on these cells, often further guidance for filling in is provided, but this will be demonstrated later. The gray cells, on the contrary, are automatically calculated based on your inputs. These cells should not be edited by the user, so by yourselves, as otherwise the automated calculations might not work properly anymore. In addition to this, the introduction just includes a brief overview on the remaining spreadsheets, but as I'm going to take a look with you at each spreadsheet in detail anyway, I'm not going to zoom into this part of the introduction now. So let's take a look at the example that has been prepared for this session. For that, we are leaving the introductory spreadsheet and we will move to one results. The results spreadsheet provides a quite useful summary of the direct and the indirect mitigation potential, as almost all data presented here is calculated automatically, but for now we will only take a look at the NSP information on the top. The fictional NSP we are looking at in this video podcast is the NSP for the energy efficiency retrofitting of residential buildings in country X. The NSP duration is 4.5 years and the requested NSP funding is 12 million euro. Additional information needs to be filled in below. For example, country, here it's country X, the applicant, here the Ministry of Environment of country X, and the sector in which your NSP is placed. That can be selected from a drop-down menu. In this case, it's energy efficiency. And in case your NSP is placed in 2 sectors, it would also be possible to select a second sector. For now, we will leave the results spreadsheet and move to 3, direct mitigation. Right on the top, the spreadsheet includes a definition for the direct mitigation, how it is understood at the NAMA facility, and then the first section already starts. In this section, information on the technology or the intervention supported in the NSP and also the approach for the determination of the mitigation potential and will need to be filled in. The descriptions on what to fill in is always provided above the text fields with white background color, so for example here. To come back to our example, this fictional NSP has the objective to retrofit existing residential buildings. In its duration of 4.5 years, 450 buildings will be targeted, both 4-story and 10-story multifamily buildings. You can check out the details in the Excel file yourselves, but just to give you some context for this video, the technical interventions of the NSP include retrofit measures, reducing the thermal and electric energy demand, and in addition, it also aims at lowering the carbon intensity of the current heat supply by enhancing the use of renewable energy sources. More details on the merits of the NSP, of course, would need to be provided in the main document of the application. And here in the annex, it is mainly a summary to provide the context for the mitigation calculations. In the next text field, applicants are asked to describe the project boundary for the mitigation determination, which is very straightforward for this NSP. So the applicant just added that the project boundary covers the complete buildings as well as the heat supply systems. In the next section, the baseline emissions need to be calculated. Similar to above, an explanation is provided that, amongst others, also includes a definition for the baseline. The first text box to be filled in asks for a description of the business as usual, the BAU scenario. The BAU scenario describes the future situation in which there will be no significant change in people's attitudes and priorities, or no major changes in technology, economics, or policies. But again, you will find the details in the explanation above the text field. For the fictional NSP, the BAU scenario would mean that the energy efficiency measures planned for this NSP would not be implemented, and that the heat supply would continue to be based on coal. Moving to the next text box, applicants are asked to describe the baseline scenario in case it differs from the BAU scenario. Here the fictional applicant explained that it will be similar to the BAU scenario, only that a dynamic baseline improvement is assumed, meaning that as a result of increased renewable energy sources in the energy mix, both the grid emission factor and also the heating emission factor will improve. Before we now continue to the calculations of the baseline emissions, we first need to take a look at the spreadsheet on parameters and assumptions. This is the sheet in which applicants should list all relevant input parameters and assumptions that will be used in the calculations. This includes constant, default values, etc. Where available, also references, evidence, or studies should be named. All data provided here will be used in spreadsheet 3 and 4 for the calculation of the direct and the indirect mitigation potential. And instead of, again, typing, for example, 0.65 for the grid emission factor in a calculation, you should rather use a cell reference in the formula, but I will come to this in a couple of minutes. A more detailed description of what to include in this spreadsheet is again provided above the list. For NSPs that include several components, it is also possible to copy this sheet and rename it sheet to A, to B, to C, depending on the number of components the NSP has. An example with several components will be uploaded to our website soon, so you should watch out for this. You can see that the table includes 6 columns in which the name, unit, and value of the parameter need to be added, and in addition, a description or a comment, the source of the values or information, as well as an estimation on the accuracy of the value should be added. The accuracy is again a drop-down menu. in which you can choose between high, medium, low, not applicable, or unknown. And here you can also see what I mentioned in the beginning. If you click on the cell without opening the drop-down menu, additional guidance appears that in this case just gives you more background information on the definition of accuracy in this annex. You can see here that different parameters have been added to the list. I will not talk you through all of them, but will give you some examples. In cell A22, for example, you find the heating emission factor on the coal-based system that will be used to calculate the baseline emissions. As a comment, the fictional applicant added that this value is based on national data, and here the source was included. In cell A24, the dynamic baseline improvement of 0.5% was added to the list. This factor was used for the calculation of the baseline scenario, which I have mentioned before. Applicants can, of course, structure the parameters as it fits their specific NSPs. And if we scroll down, you can see that for this example NSP, parameters have been structured according to the type of building that will be retrofitted during the NSP implementation. And I mentioned it before, it's 4-story or 10-story multifamily buildings. And again, it's separated in baseline values and values after the energy efficient retrofitting measures have been implemented. We will now leave the parameters and assumptions and move back to the mitigation potential, the direct mitigation potential, to take a look at the actual calculations. And for that, we will start with the baseline emissions. I'm first zooming out a bit so that you can get a better idea of how this table is structured. And as defined in the NAMA facility M&E framework, the mitigation potential always needs to be indicated and monitored for the period of NSP implementation, for the period of NSP implementation plus 10 years, and for the lifetime of the measure or the investment. And you can see in the top row that we applied a different color coding to indicate those different time frames. It's light blue for the NSP implementation. It's the darker blue for the NSP implementation plus 10 years, and then the dark blue, which marks the period of technology lifetime. In the rows below, applicants can then add items or descriptions. They can allocate a row reference and also add a calculation or source, as well as the unit. The actual values for a respective year are then inserted in the same row in the column of this specific year. For example, here for year 3 or for year 4. Of course, in the Annex 6 from the outline template, all these rows will still be empty. So applicants need to identify themselves which items will be of relevance to calculate the baseline emissions for their specific NSP. So let's take a look at our example NSP again. You recall that the technology intervention focuses on 4 and 10-story buildings, so the fictional applicant again presented the baseline emissions also split into those two types of buildings. Looking at the 4-story buildings, in row 36, the applicant added the number of buildings to be covered by the NAMA support project. As the source, the NSP implementation plan is mentioned, and you can see that the first measures from the NSP will be finalized in year 3, where 75 4-story buildings will be covered. A brief side note on this, NSPs have an implementation phase 1 and a phase 2, and during the implementation phase 1, all contracts and agreements necessary for the implementation must be established. So in phase 1, actually only minor TA activities should be undertaken, and actual investments under the financial component shall only start in implementation phase 2. So the assumption by the fictional applicant to see the first results in year 3 only is rather conservative but realistic. Other information provided by the applicant are the thermal energy and the electricity consumption before implementation of the energy efficiency measures. And then those same items have also been defined for the 10-story buildings. When applicable, applicants should always use cell references in the formulas instead of retyping values. And cell references here were, for example, used in row 37, 38, 41, and 42, where it also says that the source of this item has already been specified under parameters and assumptions. And if I double click on, for example, cell H37, you can see that it is a reference to the spreadsheet 2 parameters and assumptions. Additional parameters have been added, and then in the last row, the baseline emissions are calculated. In cell C46, the formula has been included based on variables or row references, and it has then been applied for all years of NSP implementation plus 10 additional years. Below here, the baseline emissions per year and accumulated over time are calculated automatically, as indicated again by the gray background color of the cells. And if we move to the right side of the spreadsheet, we can take a look at the calculations for the baseline emissions over the technology lifetime. What I would like to show you here is that for the central heating emission factor and also for the grid emission factor, mean values were taken. And the reason for that is that they decreased over time. Beyond that, the calculation just differs from the annual values in that it was multiplied with the technology lifetime, which has been assumed at 20 years for this NSP. So now that the baseline emissions have been calculated, we move to the next section, the calculation of the project emissions. The section is again introduced with a short definition of what project emissions actually are, and the applicants are asked to fill in information on occurring project emissions for their NSPs. For this example NSP, the fictional applicant filled in that project emissions stem from the amount of energy, electricity and heat that is consumed in the buildings which are part of this NSP, and project emissions have then been determined by multiplying the amount of energy consumed with the respective emission factor. So you can already see that the calculations themselves are very similar to the calculations of the baseline emissions, only that the amount of heat and electricity consumed has been reduced and that the emission factors have decreased. Similar to the baseline emissions, the project emissions are automatically calculated per year and accumulated over the years. And also on the right side, the project emissions over technology lifetime have been presented. Before we finally come to the section of direct emission reductions, applicants are asked to calculate leakage emissions. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, leakage is the unintended change in GHG emissions caused by the NSP, but you will again find a proper definition just above the text field. For our example NSP, the applicant indicated that the leakage does not apply for the project activity, and the reason is that the project will undertake the required actions to avoid leakage, for example by scrapping replaced equipment such as light bulbs, and by doing that the establishment of a secondary market will be avoided. This explanation would be sufficient for Annex 6 to the outline, but in the main document of the outline, of course, the TSU would expect that this intended activity to avoid leakages would be further detailed. In case an NSP would expect leakages to occur, the calculations would be added in this table, which is again similar to the ones for the baseline and the project emissions. And then here under 4, finally the direct emission reductions are calculated. And you can see that the cells have a gray filling, which means that they are automatically calculated based on the numbers you had presented above. By clicking in cell, for example, H115, you can see the underlying calculation, which is basically the baseline emissions of year 3 minus the project emissions of year 3 minus the leakage emissions. Now that the direct mitigation has been calculated, there are 3 more sections to be filled in on that spreadsheet. One is on the overall accuracy. The second is about potential risks related to the estimation of the mitigation potential. And the last one is on potential rebound effects. For all of them, an explanation is provided above the text field, and applicants are asked to fill in the text boxes and in addition select values from a drop-down menu. That was it on the direct mitigation. On the next spreadsheet, applicants are asked to calculate the indirect mitigation potential. In general, the sheet is structured equal to the one for the direct mitigation potential, only that neither the accuracy nor the potential risks or potential rebound effects need to be assessed. As this is the case, I will not go through the different sections again. The only thing I want to highlight here is that on the top you will again find the definition for the indirect mitigation potential. And then one other remark on the indirect mitigation potential is that here in the first section, when applicants are asked to describe the indirect mitigation potential, the fictional applicant only added information that had not already been presented on the spreadsheet 3 for the direct mitigation. And the same, of course, also applies to all the other sections under the indirect mitigation potential. So you can see here for the project boundary, it was only referred to the direct potential, and the same also, for example, for the BAU scenario. And we advise applicants to do the same so that you do not have to repeat all the information that was already provided on another spreadsheet. We will now take another look at the results sheet. We already covered the first section of it, where applicants were asked to fill in some basic data. And now we will have a look at the other sections below, which summarize the results of the direct and the indirect mitigation potential, calculate some performance indicators, and also include a summary table that should be used for the outline main document. For the direct mitigation potential, values for the NSP implementation, for 10 years after the NSP has ended, and for the technology lifetime are displayed automatically, as you can see again from the gray cell filling. Applicants also have the opportunity to add some comments or explanations below. And further to the right, 2 bar diagrams are displayed automatically that better illustrate the mitigation of those 3 time frames just mentioned, and also the mitigation potential per year. For the indirect mitigation potential, values for the 10 years after NSP implementation and also for the technology lifetime are calculated. And again, on the right side, the 2 diagrams will be displayed automatically. Under performance indicators, the NSP cost efficiency is automatically calculated, first separated for the 3 different time frames, and then in the row below for the NSP implementation period plus 10 years. In addition, applicants have the opportunity to add additional performance indicators. And for our example NSP, the applicant, for example, presented the specific thermal energy consumption per square meter, and then on the right side added a comment that this presents a 40% reduction compared to the current demand level. Depending on your NSP, of course, other performance indicators might be of interest, and they could then just be added here below the cost efficiency. The table here, even though it has no gray self-filling, is filled in automatically based on the calculations from the other spreadsheets. And you can see here on the top the request to please copy it into the outline main document in section 3.1, which relates to the mitigation potential. This table should make your life easier when filling in the outline document so that all relevant values that have been calculated in this annex can easily be copied to the respective section in the main document. One last thing that I would like to cover before we close this video session is the Spreadsheet 5 guidance. On this spreadsheet, applicants do not have to fill in any information. It rather serves as additional guidance to applicants on where to find information on suitable methodologies, default values, and other sector-specific information. If you look at the right side, you will find some help to assess if the references might be of interest to you and also if they are applicable to your NSP. For example, in the first half, you will receive information about the sectoral applicability of the specific reference. And in the second half, it rather concentrates on the content. For example, if it includes information on direct or indirect mitigation, or if, for example, default values are presented. With this, I would like to close the session. We really hope that this video, the energy efficiency example, and also the further guidance presented on the last spreadsheet will be of help to you when you calculate the mitigation potential of your NSP. And by saying this, I would like to wish you good luck in the preparation of your outline. Goodbye.